about two conflicting ethical principles that I believe shape the argument surrounding this. And the first principle is autonomy, and the second is paternalism. So the discussion about fat taxes really began in 1994. It got its feet with Dr. Kelly Brown of Yale when he published an op-ed for the New York Times. And he argued that society has a long history of placing the responsibility of obesity on the sufferer, and what we need to do is focus on the environment. And he believes that Congress and state legislatures could shift the focus to the environment by taxing foods with little nutritional value, and then using that money for healthy lifestyle campaigns and public exercise amenities, and etc. So what Brown was really proposing here is a Pigovian tax. So I'm not an econ major, but I wanted to try and explain this with a little graph. So your x-axis is demand, and your y-axis is cost. So say this is cookies, and here's the cost, and here's the demand. But this is the market cost. And what Pigot says is cookies, or usually like environmental pollution is the example, cause a social cost. So they're more expensive than what we pay for. So Pigot says we should tax this, so the demand is less for one thing, and we can have this extra revenue here. And so this model has been proposed for obesity by taxing unhealthy foods, and ideally the tax amount would offset the medical cost that each unit of thing causes. Well, unfortunately, there's not really linear models. Say drinking 1 Coke per week is a really high risk, but drinking a liter of Coke per day would be very high risk. So we might see a model kind of like that. But I still think that some taxes on food would be an option, and then I wanted to go ahead and talk about some ethical things. So the first one being autonomy. And autonomy means self-law. And it's a fundamental principle in biomedical context and the political context. And I want to talk about a little bit about the philosopher Mill, who wrote On Liberty in 1858. And he is extremely offended by paternalism. He thinks that taxes would, certain taxes would be a threat to individual autonomy, and he argues against limitations that claim to be for a citizen's own good, because imposing such restrictions would be an evil greater than the good that could be done by them. And like, a lot of people are really offended by sin taxes. They're saying, what right does a government that has a commitment to autonomy have to use a tax code to shape citizens' food choices? I believe that autonomy has limits in a practical and a moral sense. Mill himself identified the moral limit, the harm principle, and so society has a right to intervene in individual behavior if it is harming others. But what about a large group behavioral pattern? Is it fair to say that obesity is harming society? And I think from this class we all can agree that it is. The CDC reports that obesity is costing the U.S. about $147 billion per year in healthcare spending. We're also losing about 300,000 lives related to obesity. So yes, obesity is costing Americans money, public resources, and lives. But there's kind of this conundrum here, because obesity is not just a problem that society faces, it's a problem that society causes. So the availability, pricing, and marketing of food, and along the slew of other factors combine in ways that encourages obesity. And I think we all can agree that obesity has negative life consequences, and that Mill's original analysis of liberty is actually limited. He fails to recognize the negative value of free choice. And so say some actions in your present can limit your future. So maybe as a society we should step in and limit the present in the interest of future freedom. So I'm going to talk more about paternalism. And paternalism is defined as action by government that limits an individual's personal liberty for the individual's own good. You've all heard of the nanny state. Well, that's when a government is being accused of enforcing some type of paternalism. And philosopher Dworkin discusses that under certain conditions, such policies are actually legitimate, and that there may even be conditions in which a rational citizen would agree to having their freedoms limited, and such conditions arise when health is involved, because everyone needs health to pursue other goods. So I would argue for a kind of soft paternalism here, one that attempts to influence choices using incentives and taxes, but not limiting choices altogether. So making cookies and chips more expensive and fruits and vegetables cheaper, but not eliminating the options or punishing people for being overweight. Just punishing the choices that lead to that. So I wanted to take a few moments to compare tobacco and food because there's some lessons to be learned from the public health successes of the anti-smoking movement. So our grandparents' generation had a smoking rate of about 50%, and now we're down to about 20% of the population of smokers. What if we could lower the rates of overweight people from 60 to 30%? That would be huge in terms of lives saved and money saved. So I personally know that my grandfather quit smoking because of the tax increases on a pack of cigarettes. And so I think the comparison is justified in more ways, and that it's actually been proven that it works. So most of the internal and external costs of both obesity and tobacco stem from the fact that bad choices in either domain will increase the risk of either poor health or shorter lifespan. So the key lessons from the success of tobacco are that early public education plays a critical role, and that the prices actually matter, and using taxes to encourage and discourage behavior is very effective. So, in conclusion, I think that it is morally acceptable to include penalties and incentives for food consumption to combat the obesity epidemic. I don't think this could ever be accomplished at the federal level, but at the local and state level I think it's plausible, and that some restrictions on liberty are acceptable because it is our responsibility as a society to protect people from negative life and health consequences of obesity, as well as it is our responsibility as citizens to pay for actions that cause negative externalities. Thank you.